On this episode of China Uncensored, bathing in the purple rain? Sounds like Beijing pollution has gotten really bad. Hi, welcome to China Uncensored. I'm your host, Chris Chappell. Unless you've been living in a cave, you know that the artist known as, then formerly known as, then once again known as Принс, was found dead at his estate on April 21st. Last Thursday, the coroner's report revealed the cause of death, an overdose of fentanyl. What is fentanyl?
It is the strongest opioid-based painkiller on the market. It is 50 to 100 times stronger than morphine and 25 to 50 times stronger than heroin.
It can go by the street names China White or China Girl.
China Girl? Now we're dragging David Bowie into this? Yeah, this year sucked. Now, we don't know how Принс got his fentanyl, whether it was prescribed by a doctor or he got it some other way. But fentanyl is a big problem in the United States. According to the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, fentanyl was involved in 14% of drug overdose deaths in 2014, and it's getting worse. In other words, fentanyl is killing more people than heroin in some parts of the country. And a lot of it comes from China. In fact, buying it is as easy as doing an online search for buy fentanyl. Don't do that. And it's not just fentanyl. Dangerous synthetic drugs of all sorts are flooding into the United States from China. China supplies the raw materials and drug dealers create the finished product. With fentanyl, dealers often cut it with other drugs. That means they add a bit of it to a drug like heroin, or they make pills that look like more expensive drugs, like OxyContin. Users may not know this if they're buying it off the streets. And the big problem is, it's 50 times stronger than heroin, so that makes it super easy to overdose. Recently, U.S. Senator Pat Toomey called on the Obama administration to pressure the Chinese regime into stopping exports on fentanyl and other synthetic drugs. A reasonable request, if you assume Chinese labs were somehow unwittingly supplying perfectly legal compounds that got misused down the line. I mean, who could predict that some guy ordering raw fentanyl and a pill press might use it to make illegal drugs? And the Chinese regime has taken action in the past. Last year, it made it illegal to export a type of fentanyl called acetylfentanyl. In fact, the Chinese government has technically banned the export of over 100 different synthetic drugs. But then, Chinese labs just changed the recipe to make a new type of fentanyl, one that wasn't on the US's controlled substances list yet. So what can the Chinese regime do to stop the influx of synthetic drugs that are killing Americans? I guess the question is whether that's something they want to stop. Senator Toomey found out that apparently the Chinese law enforcement officials can't prosecute labs for shipping these drugs. Think about that. The Chinese regime can detain people for remembering the Tiananmen Square massacre, but not for shipping potentially deadly compounds? You really think they couldn't crack down on labs if they wanted to? Maybe they don't. In 2014, a U.S. Army Special Operations Command report discusses the reality of the unconventional warfare China is waging on the United States. It quotes a top Chinese colonel, Chao Liang, as saying, "The first rule of unrestricted warfare is that there are no rules, with nothing forbidden." Part of that includes drug warfare. National security analyst Joseph D. Douglas wrote a book called Red Cocaine. In it, he writes communist regimes have been using narcotics for several decades as a decisive weapon in the ongoing low-level warfare they are waging against Western civilization. According to the DEA, 90% of meth in the U.S. is made by Mexican cartels. But they get 80% of their ingredients from China. By the way, according to this report by the Department of Justice, the main source of illegal firearms in Mexico is also China. So maybe the Chinese regime knows exactly what's going on, and maybe that's why they've done so little to stem the flow of synthetic drugs. In fact, there's been a big surge in the number of new psychoactive drugs in the last few years, not just fentanyl, and a lot of them come from China. So what do you think about the Chinese regime's drug warfare? Leave your comments below, and if you like the show, consider supporting us on Patreon. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching this episode of China Uncensored. I'm about to tell you how the origins of this cenzura could undermine the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. You know, I don't feel China Uncensored is really that unique. If anything, I just view myself as one in a long line of Confucian gentlemen scholars who criticize the ruling regime. Well, it's that time of year again, when June 3rd transitions peacefully to June 5th with absolutely nothing happening in between.